We'd like to share with you a little bit about the Indiana Barn Foundation, and really the reason for this particular video is because we had to cancel our barn tour as we did our annual meeting this year and didn't have an opportunity for people to get together. So this seemed to be the next best thing, to try to share with you a little bit about the history and heritage and the importance of some of these Indiana barns, and we have an opportunity to do it in video.
I view Indiana barns, or not just Indiana, but barns in America, as being a truly American product. This is an amalgam of cultural traditions. You know, we talk about a Swiss barn, a German. These were American barns. They had elements from these other countries, but when you put it all together, the American barn is a truly American product. It is the melting pot of cultures in a building, and that's why I think they're so significant. They probably speak to that more than any other building type I can imagine, because you've got one tradition of construction type, working with heavy timbers, and then you've got another style where the form of the building was from a different culture and even different part of Europe. And then you have like the Swiss barns with the overhangs, but they were not identical to what was built in Switzerland. These were American barns borrowing from all these different cultural elements. So I see them as being highly significant emblems of the whole American experience. All these people, whether it's the Swedes, Scots-Irish, German, English, coming together and creating a type of building that varies throughout the landscape, but often they draw from various components, rarely from just one culture.
I've been with the Barn Foundation since its beginning. I was at the first board meeting, I believe. I was drafted by another member who I helped write a book about Indiana barns, actually. So I've been interested in barns since I first worked as a carpenter as a young man. So a lot of my earliest work was on barns in rural areas of Indiana. Kind of learned the trade by working on these early buildings. So I've been around them for most of my life. I've said in preservation for a long time to homeowners, if you buy a historic place, just move in. Live there, cook breakfast, find a place to sleep, make yourself at home, get your kids to school, whatever you need to do without feeling like you have to do all this up front, because until you discover the place for yourself, you're not going to be able to make the kind of contribution to it that will be meaningful to you, in which case it probably won't get preserved.
When we moved onto this property, we decided we were going to stay put, and I think that's important. When people move into a community and stay put and put down roots, it's good for them, but it's better for the places because people invest in the place, and I think that it's not so much a question of what a place owes us as to what we owe a place. And so the barn benefits us as much as we benefit the barn. It's kind of a reciprocal relationship we have. And that's been a strong sense of inspiration and motivation for both of us over the years as we've tried to stay here and do a good job of taking care of things.
The most valuable thing that I've learned in these projects, both the house and the barn, is really giving yourself time to get to know the space and not feel like you have to really know everything going in right up front. All the decisions that have to be made, it's actually spending the time that we spent actually living weekends in the barn was some of my most favorite memories. You get such a different sense of space in a barn than you do in any kind of structure, even with cathedral ceilings and finished space. But there's just such a valuable, for me it was a really valuable experience to be in the space and make decisions as they come up, and you get to know the space better. I think the decisions I would have made up front without having experienced that space firsthand would have been different. So I think that's what I personally learned from this project.
I guess the advice that I would give to anyone who has a barn who doesn't know what to do with it would be to reach out to the Indiana Barn Foundation. I've actually told quite a few people to like and join the Facebook page to be a part of that. One of my favorite subscriptions or newsletters that I get is the one from Indiana Barn Foundation, to look through it and see the circular barns and see kind of what's going on with the agricultural and the barn community within Indiana. And I just, you know, whether it be a financial impact or just a support and an educational impact, I think the mission of IBF is hugely important to our state's history and longevity of these majestic structures. We bought this farm in 2015, got married in 2016 on site. Jeff farms. He's got about 60 acres of row crop ground and then pasture ground for about 40 head of cattle here. And then we built the wedding venue that you see behind us. In 2016, we actually moved it from a site and moved it here for a wedding venue. So we did it actually for our own wedding because I think, admittedly, I was a bridezilla, and turns out it didn't have a roof when we got married, so it wasn't exactly what I had envisioned. But it did turn into a business that helps us keep this farm going. So there's obviously a historical aspect here. This barn was built in 1822. There's a cabin as well on site. And really our thought when we bought this farm, after we learned about the value of these structures, was we wanted to use the commercial income from the wedding venue to support the structures here on site, because with our day jobs, we didn't have the funding to keep everything up to the manner we wanted to. We knew that if things weren't utilized, they would go into disrepair. So we thought we would use that commercial income really to just keep this farm alive and working. So we've had quite a bit of research done about the history of this parcel of land. Neither one of us were really into history when we first bought this place. It was originally 124 acres. We got linked up with the Indiana Barn Foundation and some historians, and learned first about the history of this barn. So my understanding of this barn is that it was built around 1822. I've heard, obviously, they're hand-hewn beams. I've heard that the beams are tulip poplar and chestnut species. And from my understanding, one crib was likely put here first, with another one brought a little bit later. And what's interesting about this barn is as you expand out a little bit more, it's more of a timber frame type structure. So it just kind of shows the evolution of, how construction was done. Additionally, the house on site is also made of these same hand-hewn beams with clapboard siding on top of it. It's a hall and parlor style home, and there's quite a few outbuildings on site as well. So we're actually in the process of going on the National Register of Historic Places as a historical district. We bought it from a family that had owned it since the houses were built in 1822. So the Tate family were the original inhabitants, and the Tate family, there was a death in the family, and the Tate family, through marriage, merged into the Tatum family. So we call the house the Tatum house, and my understanding with the land itself, it was procured from the state of Indiana in, I think, 1836. And that funding, to my understanding, went to fund Indiana University. So we were just super excited about the history when we learned about it. We feel charged to continue the legacy of this family. We keep they're the Ameths now, but part of the Tate and the Tatum lineage. We keep them informed with what we're doing, and we have a lot of the family members come back to see it. And it's really cool to kind of see how people appreciate what's been done here and just appreciate some of the Hoosier history that's on site.
This is a really unique, one-of-a-kind space. This is what's known as a double crib barn. It's unique in several ways. It's a predecessor to later barns that occur in Indiana and all across the Midwest. And it's also important because of its structural components. It's a log barn. It's handmade, hewn by broad axe. And it's called a double crib barn. You need to understand that a crib, in barn parlance, if you will, is a room. So you might have a barn with several stalls for animals, and each would be referred to as a crib. So in the earliest days, you would have a single crib barn. The earliest, say, pioneer farmer would only be able to put up, whatever he had the materials for locally on his farm. And they would hew a crib, and those cribs could be used, they could be sealed up and used for grain, or they could be used for hay, which was very typical. They mainly were very primitive shelter for crops and goods, but also for animals. And so so what would happen typically was, as the farm expanded and the farmer became more affluent, they would add cribs. So they would build one, and then adjacent to it, as in this case, they would build another one just like it. If that process continued, they would build a third and a fourth, maybe a fifth and a sixth. And when they did that, they created these cross aisles between the buildings, and they left the buildings open so they could access them from all sides. Well, eventually they started to put roofs over the entire structure. And in this case, this is very interesting because it's the transition of the crib evolving into a greater crib barn, but also evolving into the barn that you might be able to see behind me, which is a transverse crib barn from 1892. This barn dates to 1822. So in 70 years, this rather primitive, early, and now very rare form transformed into what we see all across the Midwest, and as a matter of fact, all the way to the West Coast, the transverse frame barn. And what that refers to in its successor is an aisleway or driveway that goes all the way through the barn from one end to the other. So as the early farmer added cribs, he inadvertently created this aisleway, and slowly they closed off the cross aisles. So, and then he put a roof over the whole thing, and voila, he had this transverse crib barn. So it's almost accidental, but it's a beautiful thing to be able to witness on one site. And of course, this barn behind me was moved here at a later date, but nevertheless, it's fun to have them both side by side.
We've had over 100 weddings here, and I tell people that truly it does feel a little bit more special every time. You think about the folks who have started their lives here, who have, had their first kiss in that barn or right outside of that barn. And now we're getting to the point where we've been in business for about 2.5, 3 years, where now babies are starting to come. And so people are bringing their babies back, and we're seeing, like the fruits of the farm. It's just really, really cool to be a part of.
So we're Erica and Jeff Morris, and we are the owners of the Stip Bender Farm in Bloomington, Indiana. We purchased this property 3.5 years ago, and this farm was started in 1876 by the Stip family and later sold to the Bender family. This farm, what's left of it, has a historic stone wall that's dry stacked and 6 outbuildings, including the dairy barn behind us, which was built in about 1810, a corn crib, and several other outbuildings, including a forge shed, as we call it, and a hog rendering barn, along with a carriage house. And so when the farm started, it was about 140 acres, but all that remains today is just under 6 acres.
This is a really good example of a preserved farmstead, meaning that we have not only the original house, which dates to the late 19th century, but also the accompanying farm buildings. So we can tell how the farm functioned and what the primary concerns were here. There's a carriage house that dates to 1875, which has been converted to a garage, so you wouldn't recognize it unless you go inside. And then there are several other barns. The one to my left is an older, earlier form, kind of general purpose barn. And then there's a main barn which was used for dairy, which you see behind me, and then some other work sheds. There's a absolutely phenomenal crib, wheat, grain and corn crib. One of the best I've ever seen, I think. It's absolutely beautiful. And then there's a hog rendering building where hogs not only were fed but also were slaughtered, and where the meat was smoked. So the functions of a 19th century farm are all on display here, and most of the buildings are in good enough condition to really be able to read their original intention, and they've been changed somewhat over time. The house has been added onto and so on and modernized, but you really get the feeling of the farmstead when you enter the main gate, I guess. And this was at one time, you know, I don't remember exactly, but it was several hundred acres. And it's also surrounded by these, what we call Irish stone walls, but with these slat stone walls, which are unique to Monroe County in many different areas, but there are some really excellent examples of that construction, and they're historic in their own right. The corn crib it's not a particularly unique design, but it's an absolutely pristine condition. So, and it's sitting on hand-cut pieces of limestone. You can even see the drill marks where they were cut out of the stone floors in Monroe County. So they tell a story about local stone resources in Monroe County, and also the fact that they're hand-carved and fitted in the way that they are. They keep the building high off the ground, the purpose of which was to keep out rats and vermin. One side is for grain, it's tightly sealed, and the other side is for corn, which is open slatted. So it's, you know, it's just a really lovely example of that architecture. And the barn behind me, which is built in, I believe, 1910, is a multi-purpose barn, which is the case for 20th century barns. They built it primarily for dairy and milking, feeding cows, not a big herd, but probably 20 maybe. And then the upper part of the upper 2/3 of it is hayloft under a gambrel roof, all signs of multi-purpose farming that has narrowed down to kind of specialty uses. And so it's typical of what was being built in the late 19th and early 20th century. It's been somewhat modernized and changed over time. It has some unique features. It has a well inside the barn, so they could water all their animals from just a pump. And it's really organized around dairy, but had obviously had multi-uses. They probably kept their horses in there and work horses and so on. And there are various machine sheds that have been added, a blacksmith shop, things like that, that as the farm became more diverse, became more useful to homestead farming, basically. We've been living here on the Borland farm since 1986. The house is built in the 1830s by the Borland family, who were very early settlers in the Bloomington area. The younger brother was what we would now call a master builder or architect, who was responsible for doing the masonry on the first courthouse, some of the early IU seminary buildings. And the older brother was the seminary agent to sell Perry Township to build Indiana University. So they were what we call frock coat pioneers, if you want. Today they would be called developers, and they would be doctors and lawyers instead of surveyors and masons. They lived here, their family was here until about 1930, and then they sold to a quarry company, mining company, that quarried quite a bit of the property. The barn is original to the Borland first generation. It was built in 1855. Right before the Civil War, and the original Borland, one of them died right after that, and the other one lived almost to 1900. So they had a long tenure at this property. We've obviously been spending that. Well, maybe it's not obvious. We've been spending the last 36 years restoring the house, and then more recently, since 2010, have restored the barn.
The restoration of the house came first because we had to have a plumbing and electricity and you know. But the barn, actually, we decided to renovate. It was in pretty bad shape while Duncan was teaching at Ball State in between like 2007 and 2012. And in the middle of that period, we decided to restore the barn. We would come down here weekends. You know, we had a contractor and try to manage from afar the restoration. And it was challenging, but really exciting. In fact, we would come down here and spend weekends living in the barn. And that was really a great way to become intimate with the space in a way that you wouldn't if you were just on the outside of it. You know, so living in it on the weekends and spending time in it really gave us a sense of the space and how we wanted to restore it.
I live here with my wife Linda, and we've been here 42 years. We had always been looking for an old house and finally found our dream house, and it's been our project ever since. And one of the projects that we've put off for 40 years was the barn. So this is our last big deal. And I had been thinking about doing something with the barn since we moved here, really. And we made some efforts to do some survival work, replaced a couple of posts and put a new roof on it. That's been 40 years. And I took all the hay out of the loft, which was pretty rotten. And that was one of the first things I did. Before I had a stairway here, but it had a ladder over here. I put some windows in the front, and ever since then, it's like we had a leftover piece of furniture or something. Well, we'll put it in the barn. So that's what that was the function of the barn for 40 years. We'll put it in the barn. And needless to say, we had to have a giant barn sale last year, get rid of 40 years worth of stuff that we had accumulated. And it was fun. We got to meet neighbors, and one of the fun things about doing the barn is that neighbors and total strangers will stop by and say, "What are you doing here? I love what you're doing." And when we had all the siding off, people would express concern that we were taking the barn down. And but we get a lot of appreciation from people for restoring the barn. It makes us feel good. And I know this from being around historic preservation for a long time, that barns have a special place in people's hearts, and people love barns. We moved it. We wanted to get it farther away from the railroad tracks, for one thing, and the dirt floor was riddled with groundhog tunnels. You kind of had to be careful where you walked because these tunnels are pretty deep, and I was kind of worried they'd get under the piers until I learned that the piers are fairly deep themselves. That's another reason we wanted to move it. We wanted to do it on a good foundation, so we put a slab in with radiant heating, and Wolf moving from Fort Wayne came down and moved the barn onto the slab. And since then, we've worked with a wonderful contractor and a timber frame guy that works with them to gradually put things back together. It's been a lot of work and a lot of money. And we knew it was going to be a lot of money, and that was one of the reasons we wanted to figure out a way to pay for the restoration. And for years we talked about maybe doing an antique store in here. And who knows, we might still do that sometime, I don't know. But currently the plan is to do what in Monroe County we call a tourist cabin. So it's not really a bed and breakfast because we're not going to be serving breakfast to people. But it'll be rented out to people for a night or two or a week or whatever. And that's going to help pay for the restoration, we hope. I think this barn would have started collapsing in the not too distant future. And so we're glad we've been able to save it.
This is the skeleton, I guess you'll say, of a roughly 1900, late 1890s transverse frame barn. It was on this farm site from the time it was built. There's also a historic house here and several other historic buildings associated with the site that, as we've talked about earlier, are associated with the way the property was used and practices of farming and so on. This is a relatively small 3-bay hay barn, had a full loft in it, stabling for animals, limited use animals. Pretty typical southern Indiana scale for small farm buildings. And it has now been moved 25 or 30 feet from its original location. So this is an example of a historic barn building that's being entirely repurposed for a bed and breakfast and a more enclosed residential heated and cooled space, which is always very challenging in a timber frame structure because you have insulation, you have plumbing, you have heating and cooling, windows and doors, and all the conveniences of a house. And it's tricky to design it into a barn and maintain the essence of the barn while you do it. So this will display the entire sawn frame, original frame on the inside, or maybe 90% of it. So you will see that as you experience being in here once it's finished. So you'll definitely know it's a barn, and the owners have gotten this property designated historic locally in order to help them with some regulatory issues and so on, but have been really earnest about keeping the character of the barn itself. And several people ask us from the Barn Foundation, how do I do this? What if I wanted to live in the barn? And when you go through the whole process with them, they realize that they basically had to build a whole new structure in and around the barn and maintain it as a barn appearance in some way. Very few people take on the challenge. They find other ancillary uses that are maybe a little more benign or not quite as complicated. But we're always trying to incentivize people to find ways to use their barn and preserve the cultural heritage of the site and so on. And these owners have done a really, gone to a lot of trouble to move this barn, put in a new floor and so on to maintain that quality of the site. So kudos, it's not something everybody will do.
Over the past 20, 30 years, certainly in the latter part of my lifetime, we've lost a lot of these historic barns in Indiana. And that was the real reason for my getting involved, and I think for our very dedicated board of directors that we have to have gotten involved with the Barn Foundation in the last few years. There are all kinds of numbers that you can quote, but the real fact is I don't think we know exactly how many we've lost, but any of you who drive around in rural Indiana, as I have, that's what really caught my attention. 15 to 20 years ago, I used to think we had these barns everywhere, and we didn't need to worry about them. And it struck me then, a few years ago, that, hey, these things are falling down. Everywhere I look, they're falling down, or they're being taken down. And there really is a lot of our heritage associated with these barns. So it's important that somebody try to work on helping to preserve some of that heritage that's associated with them.
Well, giving to the Barn Foundation will really help realize the goal, and that is to provide a funding source to preserve these wonderful barns. I mean, that's kind of the essence of the foundation. I love the tagline, saving Indiana's heritage one barn at a time. And so for each grant that the Barn Foundation can offer to a barn owner, that helps save one more barn. And the more funds, it's pretty simple, the more funds the Barn Foundation has to offer, the more barns will be saved. So I think it's a very worthy cause, and the goal, I believe, is to build up an endowment or a source of funding so that these grants can increase both in number and in size. And so that's the reason I think it's important for people who have an interest in barns and have a philanthropic interest, that they ought to, by all means, consider the Indiana Barn Foundation as a priority.
Thank you for your donation to the Indiana Barn Foundation. It's donors like you who help to preserve Indiana's history, particularly our agricultural and rural history, one barn at a time.
Preserving historical Indiana barns, one barn at a time.
Preserving historical Indiana barns, one barn at a time.